Good evening. Next up, we have Watford at home. Kick-off on Friday evening is at 8 p.m, so if you're a fan of Gardner's World, better sort out the old Sky Plus. Well, Watford, I'm sure I don't need to inform you of their league position and all that. I do? Oh, okay then. Well, they're in 17th place, having gained 34 points from the 35 matches played so far. That's one place behind us by virtue of our superior, or more accurately, less inferior, goal difference, which is minus 15 against theirs of minus 21. Since the restart, their form has improved slightly over the last couple of weeks. Their first four saw them pick up a late point at home to Leicester, followed by defeats away at Burnley 1-0 and Chelsea 3-0, and at home to Southampton 3-1. It took a home match against the rather hapless Norwich City to see them return to winning ways, though even then they had to come back from 1-0 down to win 2-1. At the weekend they repeated that feat against Newcastle, benefiting from a brace of spot kicks from Troy I'm so hard I can beat up students Deeney. Those spot kicks owed everything to the if there's contact it's a penalty school of officiating that, regrettably, has become the norm these days. It's something that Diop and Ogbonna may have to look out for. Daisy, the socially bubbled personal assistant with a beautiful smile, informs me that they concluded two major, that is, first 11, pieces of business during the winter window, which was about 5 months and 50 degrees Fahrenheit ago. Although ostensibly signed for the first 11, sparing use has so far been made of 18-year-old Brazilian João Pedro. His is a complicated deal. Firstly, the transfer was agreed as long ago as last October, the actual transfer being delayed by a combination of work permit issues and the need for the window to actually be open. An initial fee was paid back then, nevertheless, with a performance-based bonus being paid for his performances at Fluminense while he was waiting to leave. There was another bonus payable once the ink had dried on the work permit, and further payments will be due if the player makes an impact at Watford. After all that, the maximum fee payable will be something like £8.5 million, which is small enough these days to make you ask why they bothered. So far, he's made one start and one sub-appearance in the FA Cup, and a solitary substitute appearance in the league, coming on for the last 15 in the 3-1 defeat by Southampton. The deal that brought in Argentinian winger Ignacio Puzetto appears to have been slightly more conventional in its structure, although these days who knows, especially since their old friend Scott Duxbury is at the helm, and especially since Puzetto has arrived in from Udinese, a club that has family ownership in common with the Hornets, and which, as a consequence, appears to have supplied a disproportionately high number of players, either permanently or on loan over the past few years. Puzetto's arrival for a reported fee of £7 million raises an interesting point. I haven't read any details of his work permit situation, and he's no international pedigree that Daisy could locate. I suspect, therefore, in view of his Italian-style surname, that he qualifies for Italian, and therefore EU, citizenship through ancestral heritage. Argentina has such links with Italy as well as its more familiar history with the Spaniards, which rather begs the question, what's going to happen to all the EU players in England once the transition period ends? With the summer window opening the day after the Premier League finishes, whenever that might be, it's going to be an interesting few months until the proposed October deadline day. Although the aforementioned Deeney leads the goal-scoring charts, his total has been augmented by the inclusion of 4 penalties in amongst the 8 goals he's got this season. The pair grabbed against the Geordies were Deeney's first goal since the return from lockdown. From the 6 goals scored since the restart, the top scorer from open play has been defender Craig Dawson, who followed up his first goal for the club against Leicester with the equaliser against Norwich. Danny Welbeck, as in the famous sentence, "Whatever happened to Danny Welbeck?" scored the winner against the Canaries. The only other goal this summer has been a Bednarek own goal in the 3-1 defeat to Southampton. Deeney, it is said, has been nursing a knee problem, which the usual site suggests rates him as only 50-50 for Friday night. Given that they have Manchester City to play in the run-in, I take any talk that the player might miss this one with industrial quantities of the stuff they use to keep the roads clear during normal football seasons. If they're going to rest the knee, surely it will be next week when they have the proverbial free hit against Manchester City. Which brings us nicely on to the wild and wacky world of association football. In a move, the ineptitude of which came as a surprise even to those of us who despair at the stupidity of those in places of sporting authority, the Court for Arbitration for Sport decided that, whilst Manchester City were probably guilty of breaching the FFP rules, they weren't quite as guilty as UEFA had made out, so that they would be now allowed back into the so-called Champions League. However, the CAS decided that they were still guilty, a bit, mainly of falsifying of accounts and of obstructing the inquiry. So they decided they'd give them a jolly big fine of £9 million, which no doubt will still be paid off by the owners in exactly the same way as all the other bills. Pep Guardiola stated, apparently with a straight face, that football owed his club an apology. Yeah, Pep, you might want to consider keeping stum on that subject. Quit while you're ahead and all that. It remains to be seen whether the Premier League's own investigations, which are still ongoing, are a little bit more exacting, though their record of finding wrongdoing decreases the higher a club is up the table. FFP's credibility, meanwhile, is somewhere on a par with that of PGMOL. Elsewhere, the sitcom that is Scottish football continued to play out a farce, as the legal rumblings continue to, rumble. You might recall that Hearts and Partick Thistle went to court to try and retain their status in the top flight up there. The courts looked through the rulebooks and informed them that they'd have to go to independent arbitration on the matter, at which point the SFA has now opened up disciplinary proceedings against both clubs for starting the original court proceedings in the first place. All that needs to happen now is for the independent arbitration to give the clubs back their SPL places and for the disciplinary hearing to relegate them anyway, and then we'll have the full circle. Meanwhile, the Wigan saga also continues to rumble. Having been sold by the family of iffy share-dealing, illegally price-fixing, rugby wage cap-breaking, child slave labourer David I broke a leg in a cup final, Whelan, they then got resold onto interests in Hong Kong that make old broken legs business affairs look like a model of probity. Less than 4 weeks after the new takeover, the club was put into administration, amidst rumours that bets had been placed in the Far East on the club's relegation, the inference being that the standard 12-point deduction would go some way to clinching that result. Wigan went out the other night and thumped Hull 8-0, a scoreline that those mythical Far East betting syndicates might have got lengthy odds on, had they been of a mind to clip a few bob on at half-time, when Wigan were leading 7-0. You'd have also got good price on a Bournemouth win at half-time in their match against Leicester, when the Foxes looked more than comfy. 45 minutes later, Leicester had shot themselves in the foot so badly they'd have got themselves sent home in an episode of MASH. Bournemouth's win, coupled by the 3 points gained by Villa against Palace, meant that our own Antonio-inspired demolition of Norwich was less of the decisive moment that we'd all thought and hoped it might have been, once the final whistle had gone. Indeed, Bournemouth's eventual defeat at Man City was a closer run thing than one might have liked. By the time you read this, the Everton-Villa game may have been played, so things will either be an awful lot clearer, or maybe a lot more foggy. As for us on Saturday, although Norwich went out with all the energy of a sedated snail, they still needed to be dealt with, and a 4-goal thrashing is not to be sniffed at, especially given the position and the positives of having a better goal difference than those around you when you're in a tight spot. A hearty well played, sir, to Antonio, whose performance would have caused problems to much better sides than Norwich. So he'll go into this weekend full of beans, and a confident Antonio is a dangerous one for opponents. Fair play also to the skipper. Mine was one of those eyebrows raised when the selection news came through, but he did a good job out there on Saturday to the extent I'd stick with him for this one. There might be an occasional good reason to change a winning 11, but facing Watford is rarely one of them. We still have the 2 on the treatment table. However, there is better news of Robert Snodgrass, whose back injury, it was feared, might preclude his participation for the rest of the season. He has resumed light training, and though a rating of 50% chance of appearing is probably a bit optimistic, it is encouraging that he might well be around for some part in the last 2. The other potential absentee is Anderson. Although he's similarly rated to Snodgrass in terms of percentages for a squad return, he's probably the likelier of the 2 to return to action. So let's move on to the thorny question of the prediction. Well, the events of the weekend will at least have put pay to all thoughts of a West Germany versus Austria 1982 Anschluss-style match. For the uninitiated, or those who are plainly too young to remember, this was a final group match in which, with all other games having been played, a 1-0 or 2-0 win for the Germans would be enough to see both teams go through to the second phase. Once the Germans went 1-0 up, both sides spent the remaining 80 minutes passing the ball amongst themselves, with neither side making any attempt to alter the scoreline. The local paper in Dijon actually published its match report in the crime pages, and the rules were subsequently changed to ensure that all group matches would henceforth be played simultaneously. For this match, a point apiece isn't going to be the universal panacea it might otherwise have been, and both sides will be hoping to have safety confirmed before the final games are played. On the other hand, whilst the draw would do neither side all that much good, it would harm us probably less than Watford, given that the difference that we've got in goal differences. However, they haven't looked over-convincing in the matches they've won. They were behind against both Norwich and Newcastle. On that basis, I reckon we might have too much for them. With that in mind, I'll be placing the £2.50 that I was going to invest in the Far Eastern betting markets on the result of the next Wigan match on a home win in the more traditional surroundings of Winston the Turf Accountants. Let us call it 2-1 to us, shall we? Enjoy the game.